She thought she was too good for him until she saw what he did every day before dawn. The Hartwell Music Academy cafe buzzed with the particular kind of tension that only existed among the gifted and desperate. Steam rose from overpriced lattes while students clutched sheet music like lifelines, their eyes darting between competitors and potential allies. But there was one person who never seemed to doubt her place in this hierarchy of dreams. Jasmine Lee. She swept through the cafe that Tuesday morning like she owned every marble tile beneath her feet. Her violin case, a sleek carbon fiber masterpiece that cost more than most students' yearly tuition, swung at her side with practiced ease. Conversations quieted as she passed. Not out of respect, exactly, but out of something more complex. Fear mixed with admiration, seasoned with just a hint of resentment. "There goes our scholarship queen," whispered Marcus Chun, a pianist who'd been trying to catch Jasmine's attention for months. "I heard she got another standing ovation at yesterday's masterclass." His companion, Sarah, stirred her coffee with more force than necessary. "Of course she did. Jasmine Lee doesn't know how to fail. Must be nice to be born with perfect pitch and no conscience." They weren't entirely wrong. At 22, Jasmine had already performed as a soloist with 3 major orchestras. Her technique was flawless, her stage presence commanding, and her ambition so fierce it could cut glass. She'd earned her full scholarship through pure talent and ruthless dedication, a fact she never let anyone forget. But what they didn't see, what nobody saw, was the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. The way she practiced until her fingertips bled, then practiced more. The way she checked her phone obsessively for missed calls from home that never came. Jasmine claimed her usual table by the window, the one with the perfect view of the courtyard where she could watch lesser musicians struggle with pieces she'd mastered years ago. She opened her leather portfolio and spread out her sheet music with surgical precision. Today's challenge: Paganini's Caprice No. 24. Most violinists spent months preparing it. Jasmine had given herself 2 weeks. "Excuse me, miss." The voice was so quiet, she almost didn't hear it. Jasmine looked up, irritation flashing across her perfect features. A man stood beside her table, tall, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better decades. He held a mop bucket in one hand and wore the gray uniform that marked him as maintenance staff. Noah Reyes. She'd seen him around for months, always in the background, always invisible. He cleaned the practice rooms after students left them destroyed, mopped the cafe floors while conversations swirled around him like he wasn't even human. Yes, the word came out sharper than she intended, but Jasmine didn't apologize. She had a reputation to maintain. Noah's eyes, she noticed for the first time, they were an unusual shade of brown, almost amber, flickered to her sheet music. For just a moment, something passed across his face. Recognition? Longing? Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar mask of polite invisibility. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just need to wipe down the table next to you. Won't take but a minute." Jasmine waved him away dismissively and turned back to her music. But something made her glance up again. Noah was still there, frozen, staring at her sheet music with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His grip on the mop handle had tightened until his knuckles were white. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone cold enough to frost windows. Noah startled like he'd been slapped. "No, ma'am. Sorry. He shook his head and moved to the adjacent table, spraying cleaner with more focus than the task required. Jasmine watched him work from the corner of her eye. There was something different about the way he moved around the music academy. Not quite comfortable, but not entirely foreign either. Like he was walking through a house he'd once lived in, but could no longer call home. "Hey, Noah." Both Jasmine and Noah looked up as Marcus Chin approached with his usual swagger. The pianist had the kind of confidence that came from family money and low standards. Everything Jasmine despised in a musician. "My practice room's a disaster," Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension he'd walked into. "Spilled coffee everywhere. Think you could take care of it before my next session?" "Of course, Mr. Chun," Noah replied, that mask of servitude sliding back into place. "I'll get right on it." Marcus nodded like he was doing Noah a favor and sauntered away. Jasmine felt something twist in her chest. Not quite sympathy, but close to it. She pushed the feeling down. Noah had chosen his path, just like she'd chosen hers. If he was content to clean up after people with half his. Wait, half his what? She didn't know anything about Noah Reyes except that he emptied trash cans and never met anyone's eyes. For all she knew, he was perfectly suited to his job. Not everyone could be a musician. The world needed janitors too. But as Noah gathered his supplies and headed toward the practice rooms, Jasmine found herself watching him go. There had been something in his eyes when he'd looked at her sheet music. Something that didn't belong on the face of someone who'd never touched an instrument. She shook her head, annoyed at herself. This was exactly the kind of distraction she couldn't afford. In 3 days, she had the most important audition of her life, a chance to join the London Symphony Orchestra's summer intensive program. Only 5 violinists from around the world would be chosen. Jasmine intended to be one of them. She turned back to Paganini's Impossible Runs and tried to forget about Amber Eyes and the way a janitor's hands had trembled when he'd seen her music. But some things, once noticed, can never be unseen. The practice rooms at Heartwell were soundproof to prevent the cacophony that would result from dozens of ambitious musicians working simultaneously. But even the best soundproofing couldn't contain the kind of passion that lived in these walls. As Jasmine walked to her reserved room that afternoon, she could feel the music bleeding through, fragments of Chopin, Mozart, contemporary pieces she didn't recognize. Room 7 was hers for 2 hours. She'd paid extra for the Steinway grand piano, even though she was a violinist. Something about having the piano there made her feel more complete, more connected to the full scope of the music. Jasmine set up her music stand and began her warm-up routine. Scales first, then etudes, building up to the Paganini. This was her sanctuary, the only place where she felt truly herself. Here, surrounded by rosewood and the ghosts of 10,000 practice sessions, she could forget about the world outside. Forget about the scholarship committee that scrutinized her every move. Forget about the family that had stopped calling when she'd chosen music over medicine. Forget about janitors with mysterious eyes and questions she didn't want to answer. An hour into her practice, Jasmine was deep in the 3rd variation when she heard it. A sound that shouldn't exist in a soundproofed room. She stopped playing, bow suspended in midair. Silence. Then, so faint she might have imagined it, the sound of a piano. Not from the hallway. The acoustics were wrong for that. It seemed to be coming from below. Jasmine frowned. There was nothing below the practice rooms except the old chapel hall that hadn't been used in years. She shook her head and returned to her violin. Probably just the building settling or steam in the pipes. Old buildings made strange noises. But 20 minutes later, she heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was playing piano somewhere beneath her, and whoever it was played with a depth of feeling that made Jasmine's chest ache. She packed up her violin with more speed than care and headed for the stairs. The basement level of Heartwell was a forgotten place. Dusty hallways lined with storage rooms and abandoned practice spaces that the academy had outgrown. Jasmine had been down here only once, during her orientation tour 2 years ago. She remembered thinking it felt like a musical graveyard. All these rooms that had once held dreams, but now held only silence. She followed the sound of the piano, her footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The music grew clearer as she walked, and with clarity came recognition that stopped her cold. This wasn't just someone playing piano. This was composition, original composition, and it was extraordinary. The melody was heartbreaking in its simplicity, but layered with harmonies that spoke of formal training and natural talent in equal measure. Whoever was playing knew music theory inside and out, but they also knew something deeper. They knew how to make music bleed. Jasmine found herself at the door of the old chapel hall. Through the frosted glass, she could see a single figure at the upright piano, a donated instrument that the academy had relegated to the basement when they'd acquired newer models for the main building. She pressed closer to the glass, squinting in the dim light. No, it couldn't be. But there was no mistaking that profile, those broad shoulders, the careful way he held his hands above the keys like they were made of something precious. Noah Reyes sat at the piano like he'd been born to it. His gray uniform was gone, replaced by a simple black t-shirt and jeans. His hair fell across his forehead as he played, and for the first time since she'd known of his existence, he looked complete. Jasmine's breath fogged the glass as she leaned closer. This was impossible. Janitors didn't play like this. Janitors didn't compose like this. The music flowing from Noah's fingers was the kind of thing she'd expect from a graduate student or a professional composer, not someone who mopped floors for a living. As she watched, Noah's composition shifted into something darker, more complex. His left hand worked the lower registers while his right hand danced across the upper keys, creating a conversation between hope and despair that made Jasmine's eyes water. She stood there for what felt like hours, watching him pour his soul out through his fingertips. This wasn't the invisible man who cleaned up after spoiled musicians. This was an artist. This was someone who understood music on a level that most of her classmates, with their expensive lessons and prestigious backgrounds, could never reach. When Noah finally stopped playing, Jasmine realized she was holding her breath. He sat motionless for a moment, head bowed, like he was coming back to himself from somewhere far away. Then he looked up, directly at the door, directly at her. Their eyes met through the frosted glass, and Jasmine felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with the sudden, terrifying realization that she had been completely, utterly wrong about everything. Noah's expression went through a series of changes: surprise, recognition, then something that looked almost like shame. He stood quickly from the piano bench, his movements awkward in a way they'd never been when he was playing. Jasmine knew she should move, should say something, should do anything except stand there staring. But her feet seemed rooted to the floor, her mind struggling to reconcile what she'd just witnessed with everything she thought she knew about Noah Reyes. Noah approached the door slowly, like she was a wild animal he didn't want to spook. When he opened it, the sound of his breathing filled the silence between them. Jasmine. Her name sounded different in his voice now. Less servile, more equal. I didn't expect anyone to be down here. I heard. She started, then stopped. What had she heard? Music? No, it was more than that. She'd heard truth. She'd heard someone speaking a language she thought only she understood. That was who wrote that. Noah's jaw tightened. No one important. Don't. The word came out sharper than she intended. Don't do that. Don't pretend that what I just heard was nothing. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Jasmine saw something in Noah's face she'd never noticed before: intelligence, pain, and a kind of resigned sadness that made her chest tight. You wouldn't understand, he said finally. Try me. Noah laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're Jasmine Lee, scholarship queen, future concert soloist, rising star. What could you possibly understand about playing in basements where no one can hear you? The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. She was all of those things. She had worked to be all of those things. But standing here in this forgotten basement, listening to music that made her own accomplishments feel hollow, she realized that maybe being those things had cost her something important. You're right, she said quietly. I don't understand, but I want to. Noah studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she was sincere or simply curious about the novelty of a janitor who could play piano. Why, he asked. Jasmine opened her mouth to give him a safe answer, something about appreciating talent wherever she found it. But what came out instead was the truth. Because that music made me feel something I haven't felt in years. And I need to understand how. Something in Noah's expression softened. He stepped back from the doorway, gesturing toward the piano. Then come in, he said. But fair warning, this isn't the kind of story that has a happy ending. As Jasmine crossed the threshold into the chapel hall, she had no way of knowing that Noah was wrong. This story would have a happy ending. But first, it would have to break both of their hearts. Jasmine had imagined many things about her life at Hartwell Academy, but sitting in a dusty basement chapel while a janitor explained the complexities of musical composition had never been one of them. Yet here she was, perched on the edge of a storage crate, listening to Noah Reyes speak about music with the kind of passion she'd only heard in her professors' voices. The thing about composition, Noah was saying, his hands moving over the piano keys without making sound, is that it's not just about the notes you play. It's about the spaces between them, the breaths, the silence. He demonstrated, playing a simple melody and then playing it again with different phrasing, different breathing space. The difference was remarkable. The same notes became entirely different emotions. I never thought about it like that, Jasmine admitted, and the confession felt more vulnerable than she'd intended. Most people don't. Noah's fingers found a minor chord, letting it hang in the air between them. They focus on technique, on perfection, on impressing whoever's listening. But music isn't meant to impress. It's meant to connect. Jasmine felt something twist in her stomach. How many times had she played to impress? How many auditions, competitions, masterclasses where she'd focused more on flawless execution than on meaning? Where did you learn to play like that? She asked. Noah's hands stilled on the keys. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Here, he said finally. I learned here. At Hartwell? But you're not a student. I was. The words came out flat, stripped of emotion. 4 years ago. Piano performance major, full scholarship. I was supposed to graduate last year. Jasmine stared at him. A student. Noah had been a student, which meant he'd been like her, talented enough to earn a scholarship, dedicated enough to commit his life to music. But he was here now, cleaning practice rooms instead of performing in them. What happened? Noah stood from the piano bench and walked to the small window that looked out onto the courtyard at ground level. Students passed by above, their legs visible through the glass. A parade of ambitions and dreams that he was no longer part of. My mother got sick, he said. Lung cancer. The treatments were expensive, and insurance only covered so much. I had a choice: finish school or take care of the person who'd sacrificed everything to get me here. Jasmine felt her chest tighten. She'd grown up in a family where money was never discussed because there was always enough of it. Her parents were both doctors, successful and practical. When she'd chosen music over medicine, they'd stopped paying for her education, but they'd never doubted she could pay for it herself through scholarships and talent. The idea of having to choose between her dreams and her family's survival was foreign to her. So you left school to work? I left school to take care of my mom. Noah's voice carried a quiet fierceness that made Jasmine realize how the question must have sounded. The job here came later, after the treatments weren't working anymore. The past tense hit Jasmine like a physical blow. Noah's mother was dead. He'd given up his education, his career, his future, to care for someone who died anyway. Noah, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Why would you? He turned from the window, and Jasmine saw that his eyes were dry but haunted. I'm the invisible guy who empties your trash cans. My story isn't your concern. But it is. The words surprised even her. I mean, it should be. You're here every day, and I never even saw you. Really saw you. That's the point. Noah sat back down at the piano, his fingers finding a melancholy chord progression. I'm not supposed to be seen. I'm supposed to be part of the background, part of the building. Students like you are the stars. People like me just maintain the space where stars can shine. The bitterness in his voice made Jasmine flinch. But underneath the bitterness was something else: acceptance, resignation. Like he'd made peace with being invisible. Is that why you play down here? So no one can see you. I play down here because it's the only place I'm allowed to remember who I used to be. Noah's hands moved across the keys, pulling out fragments of melody that sounded like memories. For an hour or two before dawn, I get to pretend I'm still a musician instead of just someone who cleans up after musicians. Before dawn, Jasmine realized this wasn't the first time Noah had been in this basement. This was routine for him, stealing moments with the piano while the rest of the world slept, keeping his dreams alive in the only way he still could. You could reapply, she said. I mean, if you were a scholarship student before, surely the academy would understand your circumstances. They could defer your studies until. Until what? Noah's laugh was sharp. Until I can afford to be poor again? Jasmine, I make barely enough to pay rent and buy groceries. Even if they readmitted me, how would I support myself? The scholarship covers tuition, not living expenses. Jasmine opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She'd never thought about the practical realities of being a scholarship student. Her own scholarship covered everything because her parents, despite their disappointment in her career choice, had ensured she had a trust fund for living expenses. She'd assumed all scholarship students had similar safety nets. Besides, Noah continued, his voice softer now, I'm 4 years behind where I should be. The other students my age are already launching their careers. I'd be starting over with kids who are practically teenagers. Age is just a number, Jasmine said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. Easy to say when you're 22 and right on track. Noah played a particularly complex passage, his fingers flying over the keys with the kind of ease that only came from years of training. Harder to believe when you're 26 and watching your dreams through basement windows. 26. Jasmine tried to reconcile this information with the man sitting across from her. In her mind, Noah had been ageless, not young, not old, just part of the furniture. Now she realized he was older than most of the graduate students, older than some of the faculty, yet stuck in a place where age was measured in achievements rather than years. "Play it again," she said suddenly. "What?" "The piece you were playing when I found you. Play it again." Noah hesitated. "Why?" "Because I've been playing violin for 18 years, and I've never heard anything that moved me the way that piece did. Because I need to understand what you figured out that the rest of us haven't." For a moment, Noah looked like he was going to refuse. Then something shifted in his expression, a decision being made, a wall being lowered. "It's not finished," he warned. "I don't care." Noah positioned his hands above the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. This time, knowing what she was listening to, Jasmine could hear the layers more clearly. The melody was deceptively simple, something a child could hum, but the harmonies underneath told a different story. She heard struggle and loss, but also resilience. She heard the sound of someone who'd had everything taken away but refused to stop dreaming. Halfway through the piece, Noah began to sing. His voice was untrained but rich, and the lyrics he'd written were poetry set to music. "In the space between the notes I play, there's a world I used to know, where the music never fades away, and the dreams still have room to grow." Jasmine felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd spent years perfecting her technique, her intonation, her stage presence. But she'd never written music that could make someone cry just from the honesty of it. When Noah finished, the silence in the chapel hall felt sacred. "That's what I've been missing," Jasmine whispered. "What?" "Truth. All my life, I've been playing other people's truth. But I've never found my own." Noah studied her face. "You're one of the most accomplished musicians in this school." "I'm one of the most technically proficient," she corrected. "But technique isn't music. You just proved that." She stood from her makeshift seat and paced to the window. Above them, the courtyard was empty now. Most students would be at dinner or studying in their dorms. The academy looked different from down here, less imposing somehow, like a place built by humans rather than a temple to musical perfection. "I need to ask you something," she said, turning back to Noah. "And I need you to be honest with me. Okay, when you see me play, in the cafe, in master classes, whenever, what do you hear?" Noah was quiet for so long that Jasmine wondered if he was going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but uncompromising. "I hear someone trying to prove she deserves to be here." The words hit her like ice water. "What do you mean?" "You play like someone who's afraid that if you make a single mistake, they'll take it all away from you. Every note is perfect. Every phrase is calculated. Every performance is designed to show how good you are. But somewhere in all that perfection, the music gets lost." Jasmine sat back down heavily. She thought she might be sick. "I've worked so hard," she said. "I've sacrificed so much to get where I am." "I know." Noah's voice was kind now, understanding. "But what are you sacrificing it for? To be the best violinist in the world, or to make music that matters? Can't I be both?" "Maybe. But not if you keep playing like you have something to prove instead of something to say." Jasmine put her head in her hands. Everything she'd built her identity on, her technical skill, her competitive drive, her need to be perfect, suddenly felt hollow. She'd spent years becoming the best version of what she thought a musician should be, but she'd never stopped to ask what kind of musician she actually wanted to be. "I don't know how to be different," she admitted. "Start by figuring out what you want to say with your music," Noah suggested. "Not what you want to prove, but what you want to communicate. What's your truth?" Jasmine looked up at him. This man who cleaned up after her, who she'd dismissed as invisible, who she'd thought was beneath her notice. He'd just asked her the most important question of her musical life, and she had no idea how to answer it. "I don't know," she said. "Then that's where you start." Outside, the academy's clock tower chimed 9 times. Jasmine realized she'd been in the basement for over 2 hours, the longest she'd gone without practicing in months. Usually, that would have made her anxious. Tonight, it felt like the most valuable time she'd spent in years. "I should go," she said, standing reluctantly. "But Noah, thank you for letting me hear your music, for talking to me. Thank you for listening." As Jasmine headed toward the door, she paused. "Will you be here tomorrow morning? Before dawn?" Noah nodded. "Every morning. Would it be okay if I came back? Just to listen?" Something shifted in Noah's expression. Surprise, maybe even hope. "You'd want to do that? I think I need to do that." As Jasmine climbed the stairs back to the main level of the academy, her mind was spinning. Everything she thought she knew about success, about music, about herself, had been turned upside down in the space of a single conversation. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was walking towards something real instead of running from something false. She had no idea that tomorrow morning would change everything once again. Jasmine barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Noah's composition, felt the weight of his words about playing to prove versus playing to communicate. At 4:30 a.m., she gave up on sleep and dressed quietly in the dark. The academy was a different place before dawn. The marble halls that gleamed with ambition during the day now felt hollow and cold. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way to the basement, each sound seeming to announce her presence to the sleeping building. She could hear Noah playing before she reached the chapel hall. Today's piece was different, more hopeful, with traces of melody that reminded her of sunrise. She knocked softly on the door frame before entering. Noah looked up from the piano, surprise flickering across his face. "You came. I said I would." Jasmine settled onto her storage crate, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "Is that a new composition?" "Something I've been working on." Noah's fingers continued to move over the keys as he spoke. "It's supposed to represent new beginnings, but I can't get the ending right." "Play what you have." For the next 20 minutes, Jasmine listened as Noah worked through his piece, trying different endings, asking for her thoughts on harmonic progressions. It felt natural, collaborative in a way her musical relationships had never been. With her classmates, everything was competitive. With her teachers, everything was evaluative. But with Noah, music was simply music, a conversation between equals. "What about resolving to the relative major?" she suggested after he'd played through the piece again. Noah tried it, then shook his head. "Too predictable. What if you don't resolve at all? What if the ending is about accepting uncertainty?" Noah's hands paused over the keys. He looked at her with something like amazement. That's actually brilliant." He played the ending again, this time letting it hang unresolved, the final chord a question rather than an answer. It was perfect, hopeful but realistic, beautiful but unsettled. "How did you know that would work?" Noah asked. Jasmine was surprised by the question. "I don't know. It just felt right." "That's it." Noah turned to face her fully. "That's what you've been missing in your playing. You've been so focused on what should work that you've stopped trusting what feels right." Before Jasmine could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway above. The building was waking up, which meant their private world was about to be invaded by the reality of the academy day. "I should go," Noah said, standing from the piano bench. "Facility staff starts work at 6, and I need to be in my uniform before then." "Wait." Jasmine stood as well, suddenly desperate not to let this moment end. "Your music, you should share it. With the faculty, with other students. People need to hear what you can do." Noah's expression hardened. "Jasmine, I'm the janitor. Even if I played Carnegie Hall tomorrow, that's all I'd ever be to most people here." "But that's not true. Music is music, regardless of who's playing it." "Is it?" Noah began gathering his sheet music, handwritten compositions that represented years of secret work. "Tell me honestly, if you hadn't found me playing, if I'd just walked up to you in the cafe and told you I was a composer, what would you have thought?" Jasmine opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. The truth was ugly but undeniable. She would have dismissed him. She would have assumed he was delusional or lying or simply didn't understand the difference between playing around and actual composition. "That's what I thought," Noah said softly. "Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but we both know how this works. There are people who make music and people who clean up after the people who make music. I've made my peace with which one I am. But you don't have to be. Don't I?" Noah's voice carried a weariness that made him sound older than his 26 years. "Even if I could somehow afford to go back to school, even if I could catch up to where I should be, do you really think anyone would take me seriously? The janitor who thinks he's a composer." Jasmine wanted to argue, but she was beginning to understand something about the world she'd never had to face. Talent, she was learning, wasn't always enough. Sometimes the circumstances of your life mattered more than the size of your dreams. "Your piece needs a title," she said finally, changing the subject to safer ground. Noah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. I was thinking Dawn chorus. Perfect. As they prepared to leave the chapel hall, Jasmine realized she'd been holding her breath for most of the morning. Being here, talking about music without competition or judgment, felt like the first honest conversation she'd had in years. Same time tomorrow? She asked. If you want. I want. But as Jasmine made her way back to her dorm room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The academy was waking up around her, filling with the familiar sounds of ambition and striving. By the time she reached her room, she felt like she was walking back into a life that no longer quite fit. That afternoon, disaster struck in the most mundane way possible. Jasmine was leaving her final class of the day, Advanced Performance Technique with Professor Winters, when she realized her folder of sheet music wasn't in her bag. She checked her practice room, the library, even the cafe, but the folder was nowhere to be found. That folder contained everything. Her pieces for tomorrow's masterclass, her audition materials for the London Symphony Intensive, months of annotations, and personal notes. Without it, she'd have to reconstruct everything from memory, assuming she could even remember which specific editions and arrangements she'd been using. Panic rose in her throat as she retraced her steps once more. How could she have been so careless? This was exactly the kind of mistake she never made, the kind that could derail everything she'd worked for. By evening, she'd given up hope. She spent 3 hours in the library, trying to recreate her audition program from memory, but something was off about every piece she reconstructed. The fingerings weren't quite right, the bowings felt awkward, and the interpretive markings that had taken her weeks to perfect were lost. She went to bed that night feeling like she was drowning. The next morning, she dragged herself to the cafe despite having barely slept. She needed coffee, and she needed to figure out how to salvage her audition preparation with only 2 days left. Jasmine claimed her usual table and put her head in her hands. She'd never felt so lost, so unprepared, so... "Excuse me, miss." She looked up to find Noah standing beside her table, just like he had a few days ago. But this time, he was holding something, a leather folder that looked exactly like the one she'd lost. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, setting it down gently. Jasmine stared at the folder, then up at Noah. "Where did you find it?" "Practice room 7. You left it on the piano yesterday afternoon." She opened the folder with trembling hands. Everything was there, every piece, every annotation, every carefully marked fingering. But there was something else, too. A piece of paper she'd never seen before, covered in handwriting she didn't recognize. "Your phrasing in the Brahms' second movement is aching and honest. Don't rush the 16th notes in measure 47. Let them breathe. The way you shape the melody in measures 62 to 65 is heartbreaking. Trust that instinct." A fellow musician. Jasmine's heart stopped. She looked up at Noah, who was already turning to leave. "Wait," she called after him. He paused but didn't turn around. "Did you write this?" For a long moment, Noah was silent. Then, quietly, "I heard you practicing yesterday evening. After you left, I went to check if you'd forgotten anything. I probably shouldn't have listened, but..." He shrugged. "Your interpretation was beautiful. I thought you should know." Jasmine stared at the note. No one had ever written anything like this about her playing. Personal, specific, focused on the emotional content rather than technical execution. Her professors gave her feedback that was clinical and corrective. Her fellow students either ignored her playing or resented it. But Noah had heard something in her music that no one else had ever acknowledged. "You shouldn't be cleaning practice rooms," she said suddenly. Noah turned back to her, his expression guarded. "It's my job, Jasmine." "No, I mean..." She stood up, the note still clutched in her hand. "You hear music the way teachers hear it, the way composers hear it. You understand interpretation on a level that most of my classmates never will. Understanding and doing are different things." "Are they?" Jasmine felt something crystallizing in her mind, a realization that had been building since that first morning in the chapel hall. "Noah, what if I told you there was a way for you to get back into school? To finish what you started?" Noah's jaw tightened. "Jasmine, we've been through this. I can't afford." "What if money wasn't the issue?" "Then I'd say you don't understand how the world works." Jasmine took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "The academy has emergency hardship funds, grants for students who have to leave for family reasons. Professor Chun mentioned them in orientation. They're specifically designed for situations like yours. Even if that were true, it is true. And there's more. The words were spilling out of her now, a plan forming as she spoke. The winter showcase is coming up. Faculty, donors, industry professionals, they all attend. If you perform there, if people heard what you can do. Noah stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Jasmine, I'm the janitor. They don't let janitors perform at the winter showcase. They let students perform. And technically, you're still enrolled. You took a leave of absence. You didn't formally withdraw. How do you know that? Jasmine felt heat rise to her cheeks. I may have looked into your student record, just to see if there were options. You what? Noah's voice was sharp with something between anger and disbelief. I was trying to help. You were trying to fix me. Noah took a step back, and Jasmine saw something close in his expression. This is exactly what I was afraid of. What do you mean? You found me in that basement, and now I'm your project. Poor Noah, the tragic janitor with hidden talent. Let's rescue him and make ourselves feel better about our privilege. The accusation hit Jasmine like a physical blow. That's not what this is, isn't it? Noah's voice was quiet now, but there was steel underneath. Tell me honestly, Jasmine, before you heard me play, would you have given me 5 minutes of your time? Would you have cared whether I lived or died? The silence stretched between them, filled with the uncomfortable weight of truth. Jasmine wanted to lie, to protest that she would have cared, but they both knew better. I thought so, Noah said. Look, I appreciate the concern, but I don't need saving. I've made my choices, and I can live with them. He turned to leave again, but this time Jasmine followed him. What if it's not about saving you? She called after him as they walked through the cafe. Several students looked up from their conversations, curious about the commotion. Then what is it about? Noah stopped so suddenly that Jasmine nearly collided with him. What if it's about me needing to be saved? The words hung in the air between them. Noah turned slowly, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. What are you talking about? Jasmine looked around the cafe, at Marcus Chun holding court at his usual table, at Sarah discussing the politics of orchestra seating, at a dozen other students who were brilliant and talented and completely focused on their own advancement. I've spent my entire life trying to be the best, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The best violinist, the best student, the best everything. But listening to you play, hearing the way you think about music, it made me realize I've been climbing the wrong mountain. Jasmine, let me finish. She took a deep breath, gathering courage for what she was about to say. I don't want to be the best anymore. I want to be real. And you're the first person I've met here who understands the difference. Noah studied her face for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than it had been. Being real doesn't require an audience. Maybe not. But maybe some truths are too important to keep hidden. They stood there in the middle of the bustling cafe, surrounded by the sounds of ambition and competition, and Jasmine felt like they were the only two people in the world who understood what music was actually for. The winter showcase, Noah said finally. Even if I could perform, which I can't, what would I play? I don't have any pieces prepared for that kind of venue. You have your compositions. My compositions aren't performance pieces. They're just personal. That's what makes them perfect. Noah shook his head, but Jasmine could see something changing in his expression. Not agreement, exactly, but the first crack in his certainty. This is insane, he said. Probably. Even if the administration agreed to let me perform, which they won't, I'd need someone to accompany me. Most of my pieces were written for piano and violin. Jasmine felt her heart skip. I could do that. You? Why not? I'm already performing in the showcase. I could add a collaborative piece to my program. Jasmine, you're talking about risking your reputation on someone who hasn't performed in 4 years. I'm talking about making music that matters instead of music that impresses. Noah was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. Jasmine could almost see him working through possibilities, weighing dreams against reality. There would be conditions, he said finally. Okay, if we do this, if we even try to do this, it has to be because the music deserves to be heard, not because you want to prove a point about hidden talent or social justice or whatever this is really about. It's about the music, Jasmine said, and for the first time in the conversation, she was completely certain of her words. And if I say yes, if I agree to this insanity, and it all falls apart, if they reject the proposal, if I freeze up during the performance, if the whole thing turns into a disaster, you don't get to blame me for not being what you thought I was. Deal. Noah extended his hand, and Jasmine shook it. His skin was calloused from work, but his grip was steady and sure. I can't believe I'm saying this, he said. But let's talk to Professor Chun about the showcase. As they walked toward the administrative offices, Jasmine felt something shift in her chest, a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since starting at Hartwell, she was moving towards something that felt bigger than her own success. She had no idea that the next few hours would test everything she thought she knew about fairness, friendship, and the price of standing up for what you believe in. Professor Chin's office was a monument to musical achievement. Awards, diplomas, and photographs of famous musicians covered every wall, creating a shrine to the kind of success that Hartwell Academy promised its most dedicated students. Jasmine had been in this office before, for scholarship reviews, audition preparations, and the occasional consultation about her career trajectory. But she'd never felt as nervous as she did now, sitting beside Noah on the antique leather sofa while Professor Chin reviewed their proposal. This is highly irregular, Professor Chin said for the third time, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he examined Noah's handwritten compositions. Mr. Reyes, you've been on administrative leave for, goodness, nearly 3 years now. Yes, sir. Noah's voice was steady, but Jasmine could see the tension in his shoulders. And during this time, you've been employed by the academy as maintenance staff. Yes, sir. Professor Chin set down the sheet music and fixed Noah with a penetrating stare. Help me understand, Mr. Reyes. You left your studies to handle a family emergency. Why didn't you simply withdraw officially? Why maintain your enrollment status if you had no intention of returning? Jasmine watched Noah's face carefully. This was the question they'd both been dreading, the one that required him to admit hope in the face of impossible circumstances. I suppose I never stopped believing I'd find a way back, Noah said quietly. And now you think you have? I think I have something worth sharing. Professor Chin picked up one of Noah's compositions, the piece Jasmine had heard him play that first morning in the chapel hall. He studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. These are sophisticated, he admitted. The harmonic progressions show real understanding of contemporary composition techniques. Where did you study theory? Here, sir. Before I left, I was a dual major, performance and composition. I see. Professor Chin made a note on his desk pad. And Miss Lee, you're proposing to accompany Mr. Reyes in his performance? Yes, sir. His pieces are written for piano and violin, and I believe they represent exactly the kind of innovative collaboration that the Winter Showcase is meant to highlight. Jasmine had rehearsed this argument, focusing on the artistic merits rather than the personal story. She'd learned enough about academy politics to know that sob stories, no matter how genuine, weren't persuasive to administrators. Miss Lee, you're one of our most promising students. Your audition for the London Symphony Intensive is next week, is it not? Jasmine felt her stomach clench. Yes, sir. And you're willing to risk your showcase performance, which, I should mention, several LSO representatives plan to attend, on an untested collaboration with a student who's been out of practice for 3 years. The question hung in the air like a sword. Jasmine was acutely aware that this was her last chance to back out, to retreat to the safety of a solo performance that would showcase her individual talents without any variables she couldn't control. Professor Chun, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I've been performing solo pieces for 2 years. The LSO representatives have heard my individual work in masterclasses and competitions. This collaboration would show them something different, my ability to work with other artists, to support and elevate music that's bigger than just my own technique. It was a good argument, and Jasmine could see Professor Chin considering it. But there was something else in his expression, a hesitation that had nothing to do with artistic merit. Mr. Reyes, Professor Chin said finally, could you give Miss Lee and me a few minutes to discuss this privately? Noah stood immediately. Of course. He paused at the door and looked back at Jasmine. Thank you for trying. After Noah left, Professor Chin leaned back in his chair and studied Jasmine with the intensity that had made him famous as both a teacher and administrator. Jasmine, he said, his voice gentler than it had been during the formal discussion, what are you really doing here? I'm proposing a collaborative performance that I believe will be meaningful and memorable. You're jeopardizing your own career for someone you barely know. Jasmine felt a flash of irritation. How is performing with a talented composer jeopardizing my career? Because Noah Reyes isn't just a composer, and you know it. Professor Chin stood and walked to his window, which looked out over the academy's main courtyard. He's a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when students can't handle the pressures of professional training. That's not what happened, and you know it. Do I? Professor Chin turned back to face her. Jasmine, every year we have students who leave for family emergencies or personal reasons or financial difficulties. Some of them are telling the truth, but many of them are simply looking for a dignified way to admit they're not cut out for this life. The casual cruelty of the statement took Jasmine's breath away. You think Noah wasn't good enough? I think Noah made choices that prioritized other things over music. That's fine, admirable even, but it doesn't make him our responsibility now. What if you're wrong? What if he left because he had to, not because he wanted to? Professor Chin returned to his desk and sat down heavily. Jasmine, I've been teaching at this academy for 23 years. I've seen hundreds of talented students come and go. The ones who make it are the ones who find a way to stay, no matter what obstacles they face. That's not fair. Fair. Professor Chin's eyebrows rose. This isn't about fairness. This is about excellence. About maintaining the standards that make a Heartwell education meaningful. Jasmine felt something cold settle in her stomach. Are you saying you won't approve our performance? I'm saying I need you to think very carefully about what you're asking for. Professor Chin pulled out a thick folder and opened it on his desk. Do you know what this is? Jasmine shook her head. Letters of recommendation. For your LSO audition, for graduate programs, for professional opportunities that could define the next decade of your career. He flipped through the pages. Every professor you've worked with has contributed to this file. They all say the same thing, that you're talented, disciplined, and completely focused on your musical development. He closed the folder with a soft thud. If you perform with Noah Reyes at the Winter Showcase, if you tie your reputation to his, I can't guarantee that these recommendations will carry the same weight. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jasmine felt the walls of the office closing in around her. Professor Chen, are you telling me that helping a fellow student will hurt my career? I'm telling you that the music world is smaller than you think, and reputations matter more than talent. His voice was kind but firm. Noah had his chance here. He made his choice. Don't let his choices define your future. Jasmine stood up, her legs unsteady. I need to think about this. Of course. Take all the time you need. Professor Chin smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just remember, opportunities like the LSO intensive don't come around twice. Jasmine left the office feeling like she'd been punched in the stomach. The hallway outside seemed longer than usual, the portraits of famous alumni watching her with what felt like disapproval. She found Noah waiting on a bench in the main lobby, his hands clasped in front of him like he was praying or preparing for bad news. How did it go? He asked as she approached. Jasmine sat down beside him, trying to organize her thoughts. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she tell him that his story, his sacrifice, his mother's illness, his forced departure from school, was being rewritten as a failure of character? It's complicated, she said finally. Noah's expression darkened. He said no. He didn't say no exactly. He wants to make sure I understand the risks. What risks? Jasmine looked at Noah, really looked at him. She saw the hope in his eyes, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. She saw the way he'd straightened his shoulders when she'd first proposed this idea, like he was remembering what it felt like to stand tall. She saw a man who'd been invisible for so long that the possibility of being seen again was both thrilling and terrifying. The risk that I might discover I'm not as good a person as I thought I was, she said. Noah frowned. What do you mean? Before Jasmine could answer, Marcus Chin appeared in the lobby, flanked by two other students from the advanced performance program. He spotted Jasmine and Noah on the bench and headed directly toward them with the kind of predatory smile that meant trouble. Well, Marcus said, his voice carrying just far enough to draw attention from other students in the lobby. If it isn't our scholarship queen and her new pet project. Jasmine felt Noah tense beside her. Marcus, not now. Oh, come on, Jasmine. We're all friends here. Marcus perched on the arm of a nearby chair, making it clear he intended to stay for a while. I heard you were trying to get the janitor into the Winter Showcase. That's so charitable of you. His name is Noah, Jasmine said quietly. Right, Noah. Sorry. Marcus turned to Noah with mock sincerity. Noah, I have to ask, what's it like going from emptying trash cans to thinking you can perform with the Academy's top students? Noah started to stand, but Jasmine put a hand on his arm. Marcus, she said, her voice carrying a warning. You're out of line. Am I? I mean, I'm just curious about how this works. Do we all get to bring our favorite custodial staff to perform with us? Because I have to say, the guy who cleans the men's bathrooms has a really nice whistling voice. The students with Marcus laughed, and Jasmine felt her face burn with embarrassment and rage. But it was Noah's reaction that broke her heart. He didn't look angry or hurt. He looked resigned, like this was exactly what he'd expected. You know what, Marcus? Jasmine stood up, her voice carrying clearly across the lobby. You're right. This is about charity. Because apparently, this place is desperately in need of someone who understands what music is actually for. And what's that? Marcus asked, his smirk faltering slightly. Connection. Communication. Truth. Jasmine looked around the lobby at the students who'd stopped their conversations to listen. You want to know what I learned from Noah? That all of our technical perfection means nothing if we're not saying something that matters. She turned back to Marcus, her voice rising with conviction. You can play every note perfectly, Marcus. You can win every competition, get into every program, build the exact career you've planned. But if you never learn to see the humanity in the people around you, you'll never be more than a very well-trained robot. The lobby had gone completely silent. Jasmine realized that everyone, students, faculty, staff, was watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. Jasmine, Noah said quietly, let's just go. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Something had broken open inside her, and all the frustration and disillusionment of the past few days was pouring out. Do you know what Noah did while we were all competing with each other and tearing each other down? She asked the assembled crowd. He was taking care of his dying mother. He gave up everything, his education, his future, his dreams, to be with someone he loved when she needed him most. And now he's here, cleaning up after us, invisible to everyone, still making music in basement rooms where no one can hear him. She looked directly at Marcus. So yes, this is charity. I'm hoping that some of his decency and humanity will rub off on me. Because I'd rather be half the musician Noah is than twice the musician you are. The silence that followed was deafening. Jasmine could see shock, embarrassment, and admiration on various faces around the lobby. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. Noah stood and took Jasmine's arm gently. We should go, he said again. This time, Jasmine let him lead her toward the exit. But as they reached the door, she heard someone start to clap. Then another person joined in, and another, until the sound echoed off the marble walls of the lobby. They weren't clapping for her speech, Jasmine realized. They were clapping for Noah, for his story, for his dignity, for the quiet courage he'd shown every day while they'd looked right through him. As they stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, Jasmine felt both elated and terrified. She'd just publicly committed herself to a path she wasn't sure she could follow through on. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, Noah said as they walked across the courtyard, or the stupidest. Probably both. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing what had just happened. Finally, Noah spoke again. You know you just made an enemy of one of the most connected students in the academy. I know, and you might have jeopardized your own showcase performance. I know that too. Noah stopped walking and turned to face her. Why, Jasmine? Why are you doing this for me? Jasmine considered the question seriously. It would be easy to give him a noble answer about justice or artistic integrity. But standing there in the fading daylight, with the academy looming behind them like a monument to everything she was questioning, she realized the truth was simpler and more selfish. Because listening to you play is the first time I felt like music mattered since I was a child, she said. And I'm terrified that if I don't fight for that feeling now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what I gave up. Noah studied her face for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, the first completely unguarded expression she'd ever seen from him. In that case, he said, we'd better make sure this performance is worth all the trouble we're about to be in. As they headed toward the practice rooms to begin preparing for what would either be the most meaningful performance of their lives or the most spectacular failure, Jasmine felt a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. She had no idea that their troubles had only just begun. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of early morning rehearsals, late-night conversations, and growing awareness that what Jasmine and Noah were attempting was more radical than either of them had initially understood. Word of their collaboration had spread through the academy like wildfire, dividing students and faculty into camps. Those who saw it as an inspiring example of artistic courage, and those who viewed it as a dangerous precedent that threatened the academy's carefully maintained hierarchy. Professor Chun had eventually approved their showcase performance, with conditions. They would be scheduled last on the program, when energy was low and attention spans were strained. They would have exactly 6 minutes to perform, versus the 12 to 15 minutes allotted to other advanced students. And they would be introduced simply as collaborative work by Jasmine Lee and Noah Reyes, with no mention of Noah's compositions or his story. They're hoping we'll fail quietly, Jasmine had told Noah after receiving the official notification. Then we'll just have to fail loudly, he'd replied. But failure was looking increasingly unlikely. Their morning rehearsals in the chapel hall had evolved from tentative collaboration to something that felt almost magical. Noah had arranged 3 of his compositions for violin and piano, pieces that told the story of loss, resilience, and hope without using a single word. Jasmine had never played music that felt so alive, so connected to something deeper than technique. More importantly, she was beginning to understand what Noah had meant about finding her own truth in music. Playing his compositions required her to be vulnerable in ways her classical training had never demanded. There was no hiding behind perfect intonation or flawless vibrato. The music demanded emotional honesty, and it was impossible to fake. "You're playing like a completely different person," Noah had observed during one particularly intense rehearsal. "What changed?" "I stopped trying to prove I belonged here," Jasmine had answered, "and started trying to figure out why I wanted to belong here." But their artistic progress was happening against a backdrop of increasing social pressure. Marcus Chun had apparently forgiven Jasmine's public humiliation of him and had begun a subtle campaign to undermine their performance. He spread rumors about Noah's real reasons for leaving school, questioned Jasmine's judgment in connecting her reputation to someone so unreliable, and made sure that anyone who would listen knew he considered the whole project a publicity stunt. "I heard she's only doing this to get attention for her LSO audition," Jasmine overheard him telling a group of students in the cafe. "You know, the whole 'I'm so artistic and compassionate' angle. Very trendy right now." The worst part was that some of what Marcus said contained just enough truth to be believable. Jasmine was gaining attention for her collaboration, not all of it positive, but attention nonetheless. Several faculty members had made pointed comments about young artists who confuse controversy with artistry, while others had praised her commitment to lifting up her fellow musicians. The pressure was beginning to show on Noah as well. His morning compositions had grown darker, more complex, filled with harmonies that spoke of internal conflict. He was still cleaning practice rooms and maintaining his invisible presence during the day, but Jasmine could see the strain of living in 2 worlds: the janitor who emptied trash cans and the composer preparing for his first performance in 4 years. "Are you sleeping at all?" she asked him one morning after a particularly difficult rehearsal. "Some." Noah's hands moved restlessly over the piano keys, playing fragments of melodies that didn't quite connect. "It's hard to turn off my brain. Second thoughts. Every day." He looked up at her with eyes that held exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "But not about the music. About what happens after." Jasmine knew what he meant. They'd both been avoiding the question of what would happen after the showcase. If their performance went well, Noah would face pressure to return to school, but the financial and practical barriers that had forced him to leave hadn't changed. If it went poorly, he'd be left with neither his comfortable invisibility nor any hope of a musical future. "We don't have to figure out the future right now," Jasmine said. "We just have to focus on one performance." Easy for you to say. No matter what happens, you still have your career, your opportunities, your life after this. For me, this is either everything or nothing. The weight of Noah's words settled between them like a physical presence. Jasmine realized that while she'd been thinking about their collaboration as a risk she was taking, Noah was experiencing it as a do-or-die moment that would define the rest of his life. 2 weeks before the showcase, everything changed again. Jasmine was in the library, researching performance techniques for contemporary classical music, when she overheard a conversation that made her blood freeze. "The whole thing is inappropriate," a voice was saying from the next aisle over. She recognized it as Professor Harrison from the string department. "We can't have students thinking they can just invite anyone they want to perform in our showcase." "I agree the precedent is problematic," replied another voice, Dr. Williams from administration. "But Chen approved it, and we can't reverse course now without looking arbitrary. There has to be something we can do. The Board of Trustees will be attending this year, and several major donors. What message does it send if we're featuring maintenance staff in our premier student showcase?" Jasmine crept closer to the bookshelf that separated her from the conversation, her heart pounding. "Well," Dr. Williams said thoughtfully, "there is Noah's employment situation to consider." "What do you mean?" "His maintenance contract comes up for renewal next month. If his job performance has been lacking, it might be natural for us to pursue other options." The silence that followed was loaded with implication. "Has his job performance been lacking?" Professor Harrison asked. "It could be, if we looked closely enough. Missing spots in the practice rooms, inadequate attention to detail, failure to maintain professional boundaries with students." Jasmine felt sick. They were talking about destroying Noah's livelihood to prevent him from performing, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because his presence on stage threatened their sense of institutional hierarchy. "That seems rather drastic," Professor Harrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Drastic situations require decisive action. The last thing we need is other staff members getting ideas about their place in the academy community." Jasmine backed away from the bookshelf as quietly as she could manage and slipped out of the library. Her mind was racing as she tried to figure out what to do with this information. She could warn Noah, but then what? If he withdrew from the showcase to save his job, they would have one anyway. If he went ahead with the performance knowing it would cost him his employment, she'd be responsible for the consequences. She found Noah in the chapel hall, working through a particularly complex passage from their second piece. The music was beautiful, intricate, emotionally rich, the kind of composition that belonged in concert halls, not basement practice rooms. "Noah," she said, settling onto her usual storage crate. "We need to talk." Something in her voice made him stop playing immediately. "What's wrong?" Jasmine told him what she'd overheard, watching his face carefully as the implications became clear. Noah's expression didn't change much, but she saw his hands clench slightly on the piano bench. "I see," he said when she finished. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea they would." "Yes, you did." Noah's voice was quiet but firm. "Maybe not consciously, but part of you knew this might happen. You just didn't want to think about it." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Jasmine had been so focused on the artistic and emotional aspects of their collaboration that she'd ignored the political realities of what they were attempting. "So what do we do?" she asked. Noah was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the piano keys. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made him sound older than his years. "You perform your original program. Solo. The way it was supposed to be. Noah, no. I'm not abandoning you because of some administrative bullying. This isn't about abandonment. This is about reality." Noah stood from the piano bench and walked to the small window. "I always knew this was a long shot. I just let myself forget for a while." "So you're just giving up?" "I'm being practical. I need this job, Jasmine. It's not much, but it pays my rent and keeps me fed. Without it," he shrugged. "Without it, I'm not just an invisible janitor. I'm a homeless invisible janitor." Jasmine felt tears prick her eyes. The unfairness of the situation was overwhelming. That Noah's talent, his dedication, his basic human worth mattered less than the academy's comfort with its own hierarchies. "There has to be another way," she said. "If there is, I can't see it." Noah returned to the piano and began playing one of their pieces, not the full arrangement, just the melody line, simple and heartbreaking. It sounded like a lament, like music written for something that was already lost. Jasmine listened, her mind working furiously. There had to be something they could do, some way to fight back against the Academy's attempt to silence Noah before he even had a chance to be heard. And then, like a lightning strike, she had an idea. It was risky, possibly career-ending, and definitely not something the old Jasmine would have considered. But the old Jasmine had never understood what music was really for. "Noah," she said, interrupting his playing, "what if we didn't give them a choice?" He looked up, confused. "What do you mean? What if we performed no matter what they decided about your job? What if we made it impossible for them to stop us?" "Jasmine, I don't understand what you're suggesting." She took a deep breath, knowing that once she said this out loud, there would be no going back. "What if we didn't wait for the showcase? What if we performed right now, tonight, where everyone could hear us?" Noah stared at her. "That's insane." "Probably. But it's also the only way to make sure your music gets heard regardless of what they do to punish us for it." As Jasmine explained her idea, she watched Noah's expression shift from disbelief to consideration to something that looked almost like hope. It was indeed insane. It was also, they both realized, exactly what needed to happen. At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in December, Jasmine Lee committed the most gloriously rebellious act of her carefully orchestrated life. She propped open the heavy doors to the Academy's main concert hall, the same hall where the winter showcase would take place in less than 2 weeks, and began setting up music stands by the light of her phone's flashlight. The hall was officially closed, but Jasmine had learned during her 2 years at Hartwell that the night security guard, Mrs. Rodriguez, was more interested in her crossword puzzles than her rounds. Noah arrived 20 minutes later, wheeling a small upright piano on the custodial cart he used for his day job. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. He was using the tools of his invisibility to claim his place on stage. "I still think this is crazy," he whispered as they positioned the piano center stage. "Good crazy or bad crazy? I honestly have no idea." They'd spent the afternoon spreading word about their midnight concert through carefully chosen channels. Not the official Academy networks, but the underground communication systems that existed in any community of young artists. Group texts, social media posts, whispered conversations in practice rooms. The message was simple: real music. Tonight, come if you want to hear something true. By midnight, the concert hall was half full. Students sat in clusters throughout the orchestra and mezzanine sections, their phones providing the only illumination in the darkened space. Jasmine recognized most of the faces, fellow musicians who'd been drawn by curiosity, rebellion, or simple boredom with the Academy's formal programming. What surprised her were the faces she didn't expect. Professor Martinez from the composition department sat in the back row, trying to look invisible. Sarah Kim, who'd been one of Jasmine's harshest critics, had claimed a seat in the third row. Even Marcus Chun was there, though his expression suggested he was hoping for a spectacle rather than a success. At 12:05 a.m., Jasmine walked onto the stage. The audience quieted, the rustle of winter coats and whispered conversations fading into expectant silence. "I'm not sure what the protocol is for an illegal concert," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's perfect acoustics. "So I'll just say this. We're here tonight because some truths are too important to wait for permission to share." She gestured to Noah, who emerged from the wings looking pale but determined. "This is Noah Reyes," she continued. "Some of you know him as part of the Academy's maintenance staff. But tonight, you're going to know him as one of the most gifted composers this Academy has produced in years." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jasmine saw Noah straighten his shoulders, transforming from the invisible maintenance worker into the artist he'd always been beneath the surface. They began with Noah's first composition, the piece Jasmine had discovered him playing that morning weeks ago in the chapel hall. As his fingers found the opening chords and her bow touched the strings, something magical happened in the darkened concert hall. The music that emerged wasn't just technically proficient. It was alive with raw emotion and honest truth. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't the polished perfection they were accustomed to in Academy performances. This was music that spoke directly to the heart, about loss, about hope, about the courage required to keep creating in the face of impossible circumstances. As they moved through Noah's second piece, Jasmine caught sight of movement in the back of the hall. More people were arriving: faculty members, staff, even Dr. Williams from administration, all drawn by words spreading through the Academy's dormitories and apartments. The illegal midnight concert was becoming something much larger than they'd anticipated. The final composition was Noah's masterpiece, a soaring piece that began in darkness and gradually built toward light. As Jasmine played, She understood that this music told Noah's story, the talented student forced to disappear, the years of quiet sacrifice, and the possibility of redemption through art. When the last note faded into silence, the concert hall erupted. The applause wasn't polite Academy appreciation. It was genuine, thunderous acclaim from people who'd just witnessed something extraordinary. But the real transformation came from an unexpected source. Professor Chen stood from his seat in the mezzanine and began walking toward the stage. The audience quieted, sensing drama. "Mr. Reyes," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I owe you an apology." Noah looked stunned. "Sir, I made assumptions about your departure from this academy that were unfair and uninformed. Tonight, your music has reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place." Professor Chen looked out at the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is exactly the kind of artistic courage this institution should be fostering, not hindering." He turned back to Noah. "If you're willing, I'd like to discuss your immediate re-enrollment as a student. Full scholarship, with accommodations for your current circumstances." The audience erupted again, but Jasmine barely heard it. She was watching Noah's face, seeing years of invisible pain finally transform into something like joy. But Professor Chen wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I believe this performance demonstrates exactly what our winter showcase should represent. Mr. Reyes, Miss Lee, would you be willing to open that concert rather than close it?" Over the following weeks, Noah's story spread far beyond the academy walls. A video of their midnight concert, recorded by a student and shared online, went viral with the caption, "This is what happens when talent meets courage." Applications to Hartwell Academy increased by 40%, with many prospective students citing Noah's story as inspiration. Noah re-enrolled as a student but continued working part-time in maintenance, by choice now, not necessity. He discovered that his years of invisible observation had given him unique insights into the academy community, and he began composing pieces that captured the dreams, struggles, and humanity of everyone from star performers to behind-the-scenes staff. Jasmine's LSO audition was a triumph, but not for the reasons she'd expected. Instead of playing the technically perfect pieces she'd rehearsed for months, she performed one of Noah's compositions, speaking afterward about how collaboration had taught her that music's highest purpose was connection, not competition. The night security guard, Mrs. Rodriguez, became something of a legend for her role in enabling the midnight concert. She claimed she'd known exactly what was happening, but had chosen to let it unfold. "Sometimes," she said when interviewed by the Academy newspaper, "the most beautiful things happen when nobody's watching." Marcus Chun, surprisingly, became one of Noah's most vocal supporters, admitting publicly that witnessing the midnight concert had forced him to confront his own attitudes about worthiness and belonging. He began using his family connections not to maintain hierarchies, but to create opportunities for overlooked talent. But perhaps the most profound change was in the academy itself. The midnight concert became an annual tradition, an unofficial showcase where students could present work that didn't fit traditional molds. The administration eventually embraced it, understanding that real artistic excellence couldn't be contained within conventional boundaries. On the anniversary of that first illegal performance, Jasmine and Noah returned to perform in the same concert hall. But this time, the lights were on, and they had the Academy's full blessing. As they took their bows to thunderous applause, Jasmine reflected on how much had changed since that morning when she'd first heard Noah playing alone in the chapel hall. She'd thought she was doing him a favor by giving him a chance to be seen. Instead, he'd taught her what it meant to be truly heard. And in the end, that had made all the difference, not just for their careers, but for the kind of artists and people they'd become. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.